April 28, 1944, a train station somewhere in Louisiana. The afternoon sun beat down on the platform where 8 black soldiers stood in uniform, exhausted from hours of travel, their stomachs empty. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham watched as 2 military policemen escorted a group of German prisoners of war through the station's front entrance. Before you go further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Oklahoma, Berlin, or anywhere in between. The barbed wire patches on the German sleeves marked them as enemy combatants. The iron crosses some still wore testified to their service under Hitler's banner. The restaurant door swung open for them. They sat at tables with white tablecloths. They ordered food. Trimmingham and his men were directed to the kitchen. Through the service window, they could see their enemies eating breakfast, while they stood among the pots and pans. One of the German prisoners caught his eye and whispered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "It's embarrassing." And in that moment, Trimmingham realized he wasn't just fighting a war overseas, he was living through one at home. The story begins not with invasion or occupation, but with an arithmetic problem that threatened to unravel the American war effort from within. By 1943, 12 million American men had been mobilized for military service. The farms that fed the nation stood empty. The factories that built Liberty ships ran short-handed. From the wheat fields of Kansas to the cotton plantations of Louisiana, agricultural production faced catastrophic collapse. Then, beginning in May 1942, transport ships began arriving at American ports carrying an unexpected cargo: German soldiers. Thousands of them captured in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had finally met defeat. Captured in Sicily, where American boots first touched European soil. Later, captured in France and Belgium and Germany itself as the Reich crumbled. By war's end, 425,000 German prisoners of war would be held in 700 camps scattered across 46 states. The largest camps held 5,000 men. Camp Alva in Oklahoma, Camp Concordia in Kansas, Fort Robinson in Nebraska. But the real story unfolded in 511 smaller branch camps, hastily constructed compounds placed wherever labor shortages threatened the war economy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established clear rules. Prisoners must be treated humanely. They must receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. They could not be forced to perform military work, but could be employed in agriculture and non-military industries. They had to be paid. The contradiction was built into the system from the start. German soldiers who had fought under swastika banners were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, the equivalent of an American Army private's wages. They worked alongside American civilians. They shopped in camp canteens stocked with cigarettes, beer, and chocolate. Some camps organized educational programs. Others fielded soccer teams and theater troupes. The prisoners at Fort Robinson built a scale model of a German village, complete with a church steeple and miniature houses. Camp newspapers printed in German reported on war news and camp activities. Meanwhile, in the same states, black American soldiers trained for combat under segregation's iron law. Jim Crow ruled the South with a viciousness that made daily life a navigation of humiliation. At Camp Alva, the hardcore Nazis as officers, Gestapo operatives, the true believers, were housed separately from other prisoners. The camp earned the nickname Nazilager from other German hosts. These were the men who had implemented Hitler's racial ideology in Europe, and they could eat in restaurants that refused service to black Americans in uniform. Corporal Trimmingham wrote a letter to Yank magazine, a publication distributed to American servicemen worldwide and widely read in barracks, camps, and overseas posts. His words, published on April 28, 1944, struck like lightning. Here are we, soldiers of the U.S. Army, sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this our country, being treated like dogs. It was a statement that stripped away euphemism and patriotism alike, leaving only lived experience. The letter detailed that morning at the Louisiana train station with precision and restraint, which made it all the more devastating. The waitresses would not serve us in the dining room, but the German prisoners of war ate before our very eyes. They were not only being well treated, but being well fed. Trimmingham did not exaggerate or speculate. He simply described what he saw, trusting readers to understand the implications on their own. The magazine received over 300 letters in response, an extraordinary volume for a single piece. Some supported Trimmingham, thanking him for saying publicly what many had whispered privately. Many did not. White soldiers wrote to defend segregation as necessary, traditional, and proper, insisting that the treatment of black servicemen had nothing to do with the treatment of enemy prisoners. The debate raged through the summer of 1944 as American forces fought their way through France. The contradiction could not be hidden, even amid battlefield victories. German prisoners could board buses without restriction. Black soldiers had to sit in the back. German prisoners could attend movies without segregation. Black soldiers faced separate entrances and balcony seating. The enemy was afforded dignity that fellow Americans were denied, not by accident but by design, reinforced daily through policy and custom. The prisoners worked. That was the point of the entire system. From dawn until dusk, German POWs harvested wheat in Kansas, picked cotton in Mississippi, cut sugar cane in Louisiana, and worked in food processing plants in Nebraska. Farmers desperate for labor paid the government for prisoner work crews, and the arrangement was praised as efficient and humane. That efficiency stood in stark contrast to the nation's refusal to extend even basic respect to black soldiers who wore its uniform and risked their lives in its name. The government paid the prisoners. The Geneva Convention mandated it. The arithmetic worked for everyone except for the black Americans who watched enemy soldiers receive opportunities they themselves were systematically denied. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, over 4,000 German prisoners lived in a compound that stretched across 640 acres. The camp sat at the junction of 3 railroad lines. Prisoners worked the surrounding farms during planting and harvest seasons. They were productive. They were compliant. Most of them, anyway. In November 1943, the camp's compliance shattered. A prisoner named Johannes Kunz made the fatal mistake of sharing information about escape plans with American authorities. Or perhaps he simply questioned Nazi ideology too openly. The exact trigger remains disputed. What happened next was not. On November 4th, approximately 200 prisoners assembled for a kangaroo court. They beat Kunz to death with clubs and fists. His body bore evidence of prolonged brutality. 5 prisoners were eventually convicted of murder and hanged at Fort Leavenworth in July 1945. The war in Europe had already ended. The executions were carried out anyway. This was the reality beneath the surface. Many prisoners adjusted to captivity with surprising ease. Some formed friendships with American guards and civilian workers. Others plotted resistance and maintained Nazi ideology with fanatical dedication. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, 25 German prisoners tunneled 178 feet under the compound fence in December 1944. They escaped into the desert, believing they could reach Mexico. All were recaptured within weeks, dehydrated and exhausted. The escape was impressive as engineering. It was futile as strategy. The tension existed in every camp. Anti-Nazi prisoners who welcomed capture as liberation from Hitler's regime. Committed Nazis who saw cooperation with Americans as betrayal. And the vast majority in between men who simply wanted to survive until they could go home. Camp officials struggled to manage these competing factions. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes, as at Concordia, they discovered too late that violence had festered in the compounds they believed they controlled. But the prisoners kept working. By 1945, German POWs constituted a crucial component of American agricultural production. Without their labor, food shortages would have crippled the home front. The system worked precisely as designed. It just revealed uncomfortable truths about who benefited from that design and who did not. The fracture lines ran everywhere. Black nurses, trained at great expense and desperately needed, found themselves assigned to care for German POWs, while white nurses treated American soldiers. Eleanor Powell, a black nurse at Camp Florence in Arizona, fell in love with a German prisoner named Frederick Albert. Their relationship scandalized both American authorities and fellow prisoners. Yet it highlighted a cruel irony: she could not eat in the same restaurants as the man she loved, not because he was German, but because she was black. Powell and Albert married after the war and moved to Germany, where her dignity was respected in ways it never had been in her own country. They built a life together far from the segregated South. Their story was exceptional in its details, but representative of a larger truth of war, revealed fissures in American society that propaganda could not paper over. In 1945, as victory in Europe became certain, the government faced a logistical challenge. What to do with 425,000 German prisoners scattered across the continent? The decision was made quickly. Repatriation would begin immediately. By early 1946, ships loaded with former POWs steamed back across the Atlantic. Some prisoners requested permission to remain in America. A few succeeded. Most were denied. By the end of 1946, the camps had emptied. The barracks were torn down or repurposed. The prisoners returned to a Germany that barely resembled the nation they had left. Many German POWs remembered their American captivity with something approaching fondness. They had been well fed in a country that suffered no food shortages. They had been treated, by and large, according to the Geneva Convention standards. Some maintained correspondence with American farmers and guards for decades after the war. They had experienced America at its most prosperous and powerful. They had also witnessed its deepest contradictions. The black soldiers who had watched German prisoners receive dignities they themselves were denied did not forget. Their testimony fueled the growing momentum for civil rights. Trimmingham's letter became evidence that segregation was not merely unjust, but strategically stupid. How could America claim moral authority over Nazi Germany while practicing racial apartheid at home? The question had no good answer. It festered. It grew. It eventually helped dismantle the system that had created such absurd cruelties. The last German prisoner left American soil in late 1946. The camps were dismantled. The guard towers came down. Farmers went back to hiring American workers as servicemen returned home. The extraordinary moment when enemy soldiers had worked American fields while being treated better than black citizens faded into memory. But it did not disappear. In the decades after the war, historians began excavating the story. Museums opened at sites like Camp Concordia and Fort Robinson. Veterans on both sides shared their memories. The complexity emerged slowly. This was not simply a story of American generosity toward defeated enemies, nor was it a simple tale of racist hypocrisy. It was both. The same nation that had mobilized unprecedented industrial might to defeat fascism had maintained a racial caste system that denied fundamental dignity to millions of its citizens. The German prisoners saw it. That was perhaps the most damning aspect. They arrived expecting concentration camps, or something approaching the harsh conditions they had inflicted on Russian prisoners. Instead, they found abundance, order, and opportunity. Many wrote home about the impossible contradictions: farmers desperate for labor, but refusing to hire black workers at fair wages; restaurants that served enemy combatants but turned away black soldiers; a nation fighting for freedom abroad while practicing segregation at home. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. It became a weapon in the civil rights movement's arsenal. How could segregationists claim moral superiority while German POWs testified to receiving better treatment than black Americans? The answer was they could not convincingly. The war that had been fought to defeat Nazi racism exposed American racism in ways that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. It created a moral contradiction that cut through propaganda, speeches, and patriotic rituals, forcing uncomfortable comparisons that many preferred to avoid but could no longer ignore. For black Americans, especially those in uniform, the contradiction was lived rather than theoretical. They watched enemy soldiers eat in dining cars, sleep in clean quarters, and walk through towns under guard yet without humiliation, while they themselves were denied basic respect. The symbolism was devastating. The nation proclaimed democracy abroad while rationing dignity at home, and the evidence traveled on trains and letters and through whispered conversations. Today the sites remain. At Camp Concordia, a museum preserves the memory of 4,000 German prisoners who once lived and worked in the Kansas prairie. At Fort Robinson, interpretive signs mark where compounds once stood. The stories are told carefully now, acknowledging the complexity, resisting easy conclusions while refusing to erase the discomfort that history still carries. These were not simply victims or villains. They were men caught in history's currents, afforded unexpected grace by some Americans, and witnessing inexcusable cruelty toward others. Many German prisoners arrived expecting brutality and instead encountered routine, structure, and even moments of kindness. Many black Americans expected equality and service and instead encountered exclusion, insult, and systemic indifference. The farmers who hired prisoner work crews were not making political statements. They needed labor, and the government provided it. Crops needed harvesting, fences needed repair, and wartime shortages made pragmatism unavoidable. The guards who supervised the camps were not philosophers of equality. They were following orders, enforcing regulations, and trying to prevent escapes while finishing their shifts and returning home. The system operated according to its internal logic. Prisoners could be reformed, their labor utilized, their potential redemption acknowledged. International law demanded humane treatment, and compliance became a point of national pride. But that same logic did not extend to black Americans, who were citizens in theory and subjects in practice, constrained by Jim Crow statutes and unspoken rules enforced with violence. Rupert Trimmingham survived the war. He returned to civilian life, carrying the memory of that train station, that moment when he saw his enemies eating food he was denied. His letter had sparked national debate, but it had not ended segregation. That would take another 2 decades of struggle, of marches and boycotts and legislation. But his words remained, preserved as testimony rather than resolution. They testified to a specific kind of wound, the recognition that one's nation valued the dignity of its enemies more than the dignity of its own people. This realization did not fade with time. It hardened into resolve, into questions that demanded answers, into a refusal to accept gradualism as justice. The German POWs went home to a shattered country that would spend decades rebuilding. Some prospered, some struggled. Some never spoke of their time in America, folding those memories into private silence. Others could not stop talking about it, the abundance, the order, the strange grace of being treated humanely by a nation they had tried to destroy. They had seen America's greatness and its shame often in the same moment, without fully understanding either. The black soldiers who survived the war came home to a country that still demanded they ride in the back of the bus, step aside on sidewalks, and temper their ambitions. But they had also served abroad, had seen other places where their humanity was not questioned, had fought for a freedom they were determined to claim for themselves rather than postpone. The war changed them. It made waiting intolerable. Patience began to look like complicity, and silence like surrender. The civil rights movement that would transform America had many sources: churches, courts, organizers, students. The experience of black servicemen who had been denied dignity while watching their enemies receive it was one of those sources, powerful and enduring. The camps are gone now. The prisoners long since returned or buried. The guard towers dismantled, the barracks erased by weather and time, but the photographs remain. German POWs smiling in American fields, black soldiers in uniform standing at attention, their dignity radiating despite the system designed to deny it. Those images still ask a question the nation continues to answer, slowly, imperfectly, and aloud. The two images held together tell a story more complicated and more painful than simple narratives of American virtue or American evil. They tell the story of a nation powerful, enough to defeat fascism abroad and terrified of equality at home. A nation that could extend unexpected grace to its enemies and brutal denial to its own people. A nation at war with itself even as it mobilized to save the world. That was the human side of American POW camps in World War II. Not simple, not comfortable, but true. And in that truth, the seeds of transformation that would reshape America in the decades to come.